Welcome back after I hope you had a really nice lunch. We have a wonderful session now, a really important session with three fantastic speakers talking about inequalities and basic income. A huge welcome to folks joining us also online. And to remember, feel free to ask any questions through the submit the questions box, and we'll be keeping an eye on that to feed back to our speakers and colleagues in the room. So we'll just follow the list of speakers as they appear in the program. Everyone's got 15 minutes to speak. We'll follow by a couple of questions before the next speaker gets up, and then hopefully we've got a little bit of time at the end for a bit more of a collective discussion. So I'm going to hand over now to Kristin O'Connell and Jay Coonan from the Antipoverty Centre. Thanks.
Yeah. All right. So just a quick introduction. My name is Jay, and this is Kristin O'Connell. We're from the Antipoverty Centre. We both rely on social security payments. I myself on job seeker, and Kristin's on the disability support pension. So we established the Antipoverty Centre last year to counter problems with academia, think tanks and others within the political class, making harmful decisions on behalf of people that they purport to represent. So that's just a bit of a thing about us, and I'll just hand over to Kristin, who's going to do a acknowledgement of country.
Thanks, Jay. Today we're very privileged to be meeting on Turrbal and Jagera country. We pay respect to their elders past and present and extend this to elders across the continent and to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander folks who are here in this session and at this conference. And I want to quote my comrade Demir, who's actually in the room today for once, and something that she said at a conference last year, which I think of often, which is that for tens of thousands of years prior to colonisation, a sustainable and egalitarian economy existed on this continent. I think that's very useful context when we're thinking about the concept of a basic income and whether it's monetary or not. So today, the extreme harms caused by invasion are still acutely felt by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but we really see the effects of this, I think, in the higher rates of poverty, incarceration, disability, and unemployment compared to the rest of the population. So colonial violence is active, it's ongoing, with governments perpetuating complex barriers to work caused by the intersections of dispossession, racism and disability. And they're using Black communities to run their most brutal social security experiments. And if you were in the previous session, you would have seen Zoe talk about that quite a bit. So it was very difficult to sit down and write this because our philosophy and our approach is built on the idea that the conditions imposed on poor people in this country are part of a very complex system that must be thought of as a whole and not its constituent parts to be fully appreciated. So we're not going to be able to convey it as thoroughly as we would like to, but we will do our best. Poverty is a key design feature of government policy. We describe the government's employment and welfare policies as a poverty machine because they create and perpetuate poverty and they trap us in it. It's not just the state, it's the state of things. So the poverty machine encapsulates the social security system itself, and it's broader than that. It's the entire ecosystem around it. It's the people who design it, it's the social attitudes to welfare recipients, and it's the conditions of insecure and low-paid work, just to name a few. There are many players who form in the ecosystem that creates the poverty machine, and it includes academics, and it even includes the academics who have good intentions and want to see a more just world. And we can talk about that in the questions because we don't have time to explain that right now. So I'm going to hand over to Jay for a moment.
Yeah, so the biggest lie used by both the Coalition and Labor parties and groups is that our social security system is the best in the world, when in reality, the welfare system is a tool of social murder. It basically kills people. It's what it does. Meanwhile, politicians boast of its efficiency and that it is highly targeted to ensure that it helps those who need it most, while excluding everyone else and those who it is helping, it is harming. So the government is designing unemployment into the economy, then punishing people for doing the job of putting downward pressure on wages. Our welfare system is the inverse of a supportive livable income guarantee or a universal basic income, where all these different pieces work together to weigh people down, to break people down. So conditionality, the set of hoops we must jump through to qualify for a welfare payment, is only one of the many cogs in which keeps this machine running. It's also people, the people in government, everyone who participates in the policy making and advocacy industries, media are all crucial, and they operate in a manner that serves the same purpose, and that's to oppress us. So the poverty machine isolates people from one another, and it prevents us from participating in society, particularly from organising and mobilising to advance our rights. It is designed to maintain control of certain classes of people and to restrict our access to financial security. It is perpetuated and enforced by the combination of an unlivable payment rates and a punitive mutual obligation system.
And that's that dual punishment of low payments and conditionality. They're both necessary features, but today we're going to use the very limited time we have just to focus primarily on that conditionality piece. And the title of this talk, if we had slides, would be Conditionality is Killing People, because that's the reality. It's kind of the key features that we're talking about when we say conditionality are the onerous and intimidating way that payments are administered and monitored, the rules that are designed to exclude people from the system altogether, and the activities that people are forced to do. So it's not just the activities that we're referring to when we say conditionality. Over the past decade, as forced participation in activities has become more extreme and been expanded to more people, including people on the disability support pension, if you're under 35, the poverty gap has also dramatically widened. We use that term. I think it's hopefully pretty obvious, but it just means the difference between the payment that people get and what the Henderson poverty line is at the moment. So conditionality is really the engine of the poverty machine, despite those payment levels. It's sold to the public and to those of us who are in the welfare system as being designed to get people jobs, but it does not help poor people. Conditionality itself, independently of poverty, as I said before, is actually killing people, and that's both slow death and also quite concrete outcomes from different activities. One thing I mention often, if you've seen me talk before, is the very steady stream of messages that I get from people who feel that suicide and self-harm are their only options, and that is what the government actually wants for them. That is a choice the government is knowingly making. And to be fair, it is a choice the government is knowingly making, because we go to the Senate every fucking month and we tell them this. And as I said in a hearing last week, we tell you this every time and nothing changes. Why do you act surprised when I come here and get mad? So the way you're forced to engage with this system breaks you, and the deep fear, like it can be just the tiniest things, right? Like the fear that the Centrelink app won't work, that you'll have an error when you're trying to report. Then that last happened to me. I was just like, am I going to wake up tomorrow with no payment because this thing broke? I can't afford for that to happen. So there's all of this kind of, from the tiniest things that happen in your everyday life right up to having to go and work unpaid for 25 weeks. There's kind of this huge scope of this system.
So the most significant attack on the safety net in the past decade was access to the disability pension under the Labor government, where they dramatically restricted the program. This was openly done in the name of budgetary savings, and that's in a statement by Jenny Macklin. They didn't even attempt to suggest it would benefit disabled people. We have since seen an explosion of disabled people trapped on unemployment payments, and the average duration on the job seeker payment is now about 6 years. This removes people's ability to manage their health conditions, exacerbating their disabilities. So other punitive rules exclude people from the system based on their family situation, robbing them of their independence, and trapping people in violent homes. 13% of women who left a violent partner returned because they did not have any money or adequate financial support. So if you have a partner earning about $50,000 a year, you can't get an income support payment, and people under 21 are assessed on their parents' income. So cashless welfare has also been used to target and punish First Nations people, violating their rights, undermining agency, and excluding people from informal cash-based economy that helps stretch meagre welfare payments further, as was discussed with Zoe before. And crucially, a lot of people can't get a payment at all, regardless of other circumstances. And that's because the condition of accessing social security is that you must be a citizen in violation of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So it's quite obvious that your need to eat or be housed has no bearing on where you were born or which border you might have crossed. So the effect of punishing, demoralizing, and the pointless task is fear and desperation felt by hundreds of thousands of people, and millions of welfare payment suspensions each year It's being confused constantly. It's being bullied by unemployment cops, tasked with policing people and extracting savings for government by cutting us off. So-called employment services, parking lot for disabled people, unpaid carers, including parents, black folks, homeless people, those who've been incarcerated, refugees, and migrants. Activities are imposed on and silo people on the basis of race, disability, caregiver status. They include everything from endless job agency appointments to worthless and demeaning training and parenting classes. The most punitive parts of the system are free labour programs like Work for the Dole, the racially targeted community development program, and countless people are severely and sometimes permanently injured in these programs. And there's the most high-profile case in 2016 of Josh Park-Fing, who died on a Work for the Dole site in Toowoomba. And there's other examples. But anyway, governments have spent tens of billions of dollars a year on this program to literally create barriers to work. There's extensive research that shows that people subjected to mutual obligations take longer to find a job, and when they do get a job, take longer to find a job, and when they get anyway, let me move on. Perversely, despite endless reports of abuse and neglect, the private providers we're fooled to engage with effectively have unconditional funding, while they will conditionality as a tool to deprive us of funds. It's no coincidence that the savings from the DSP restrictions were transferred to disability employment services, a system that has 300,000 people in it. Each month, roughly 1% to 2% of people in the system are reported as having a job for 52 weeks or longer. So it's an industry designed purely to profit from disability, soaking up funds that should be used to actually help us by forcing people into activities that lead us nowhere and in many cases cause harm. So the same organizations that claim they exist to help poor people participate in and profit from this system using the poverty machine to derive funding. So as of January in 2022, the biggest abusers for Work for the Dole was Salvation Army at 288 sites nationally, St. Vincent de Paul, 189, and Lifeline, 45. And the majority of those would be op shops, basically.
And that's out of a total of 900. So like proportionally.
And there's a lot of churches and everything in there as well. So Salvo's is the largest user of Work for the Dole. It pays less than $2 an hour, which people have reported, abuse in their op shops, whether it's homophobia, unsafe work conditions, where people are forced to sort through like soiled clothing and bedding and broken items under the threat of their payments being cut off. So an Antipoverty Centre survey that we started this year, from the results, 97% of participants who have responded told us they didn't want to do Work for the Dole, surprisingly. Only 17% said their rights had been explained to them, and only 4% of survey respondents got a job from it.
Wow.
So,
how on earth did we get here? When people say the welfare system is broken, we don't actually agree with that. The system is working exactly as it is designed. Conditionality exists today as a legacy from when full employment policies were abandoned in the 70s. Not that we are endorsing full employment policies. And so instead of people having a job when they needed one, they were forced to rely on welfare. And of course, then that makes the government think, oh, holy dooly, we've got all this money we have to spend on welfare. How are we going to get people out of that situation? So the kind of myth that underpins mutual obligations is that they're to get you work ready. And that's really kind of exposed when you contrast it with the austerity approach to public policy that actually prioritizes making savings by using compliance as a budget tool, as a budget savings tool. So when Howard sort of was talking about mutual obligations in the 90s, around the time of them being ramped up and privatisation being introduced, was to say it is fair and reasonable to ask unemployed people to participate in an activity which both helps to improve employability and makes a contribution into the community. And I think that's extremely moralising. It also is couched in terms that are very political, and they're very important, because when we're talking about what's reasonable and what's fair and what is a contribution, that is sending a signal to the population, to everyone in the public, about who's deserving and who's not deserving of help. So when we're talking about that kind of morality position, we're starting to, it leads you down the path of questioning, okay, well, what is enough? What is a contribution? And who gets to define those things? And I tend to think about this stuff in terms of being like a means test for activity. So we talk about a means test being the financial income you have that will cut you off a payment, but this is more of a means test for your social contribution, I think. And over time, the temperature has been dialed up on that social means test, which has led us to the point where we now have this insanely complex and punishing system. So the success of government propaganda is why we're here. They've gotten away with brutalising unemployed people because they are successful and they are not really being challenged effectively. The status quo is kind of being, allowed to continue at the moment. So although we do have politicians pushing this line, we also have people who are on payments themselves who've internalised all of that messaging too and feel undeserving. And people are buying into the myth of being a dole bludger when, of course, there is no such thing as a dole bludger. Thank you. Yeah. Well, I can skip right ahead to our final paragraph, which Jay is going to read very eloquently, and hopefully we can get into the rest in the questions.
So basically when it comes to UBI, the context of why we're all here, we don't really care about the model, whether it's a UBI, livable income guarantee, or something else. So these debates don't matter to people in situations like ours who are being bullied, used as economic fodder. They don't matter to people dying in the system designed to hurt us, even if it is to return to a genuine full employment economy. Social security payments must be generous and unconditional. So basically, to sum it up, what matters to us are the fundamentals. People need to be out of poverty and they need not to be punished. That's why any proposal with a rate below the poverty line or tweaks to activity testing doesn't work for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, that was very rushed.
Hey, just a couple of questions before we move to Jane. Any pressing questions or comments that people would like to make? It's fantastic. And can I just say the T-shirts downstairs, Break the Poverty Machine, the whole concept came from these folks. So
And actually from discussions with you.
No. So make sure you grab yours.
Yeah, we didn't know that they were going to be there.
No, we did not. We did not plan the T-shirts.
That wasn't a plan.
Any comments or questions people have? Great, thank you.
So can you just confirm you do support the introduction of universal basic income in Australia?
Yeah, like that's kind of what we mean by being agnostic, right? So sure, have a UBI, that sounds great, as long as the payment is above the poverty line. And obviously often at conferences like this, there's a lot of discussion about should we maybe like give everybody $10 a week and start to dial it up slowly so that in several generations, there might be enough money for everyone, right? If there's going to be a UBI, our position is it has to be introduced at a baseline so that people have enough money to live. Because the problem, of course, is then you can weaken the safety net, or it can be disappeared and replaced altogether. And then you have either just as bad a situation as we're in now, potentially a worse situation. So yes, UBI is good if it's adequate.
Thank you.
There's a question on here.
Oh, fab. Okay.
It says, how would you see the flawed NDIS interacting with UBI?
Great question. Thanks, Tim.
Well, I mean, a UBI shouldn't come at the cost of a social wage, which is, the reason one of the lines trotted out by labourists mainly of why we don't, or why people don't deserve a higher rate of social security payment is that, unlike during Henderson, which is what we call for, they didn't have a social wage like Medicare and so forth. To my response is like, well, yeah, they pretty much destroyed that and it's only going to get worse. Universal health is not in the position that it is. So to that, any kind of social wage shouldn't come at the cost of a basic income.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to add to that too. So I'm on the NDIS. I'm extremely lucky to be on the DSP and the NDIS because the government actively makes it very, very, very hard to access those supports. And another part of that kind of propaganda that's been super successful is governments kind of suggesting that the NDIS is a replacement for the DSP and that we don't kind of need the DSP anymore because, thank you, Jane, probably is like most closely relating to attempts to interact with these systems and programs. The NDIS will not cover your housing, it won't cover your food, it won't even cover my medication, even though my medication is for my disabilities. So like it doesn't cover your living costs and it's actively designed to not cover your living costs. So the NDIS is very flawed, yes. Only 13% of people who've got a disability actually access it at the moment. I don't think we are even within really decades of thinking about whether the NDIS could interact with the UBI in an effective enough way that you could have a baseline payment that's the same for everyone, because it would need to neutralise the additional cost of disability for everyone who has a disability, and we would also have to have the removal of discrimination in the workforce, because ultimately, if your prospects of getting employed in your life are quite low, our social security system should be acting as a lifelong wage replacement. It shouldn't be acting as like a bare survival payment, which is not even is at the moment.
Yeah. Okay. Hopefully we'll have more time to come.
Long answers. Sorry, guys. Jane, I hope we didn't take up your time.
Very much, and that's a nice segue into Jane Scott's paper, how a universal basic income could allow people with a disability to thrive. We're just going to adjust it. Oh, beautiful.
We'll meet in the middle.
We'll meet in the middle.
It will make a hideous noise, slightly as we go up, and a really, really horrible one as we come down.
I think that's perfect.
Yeah, that's good.
I'll show you. That's the video there, Jane.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I'm just checking it.
And is that going to be okay?
Yeah,
there?
no, that's fab.
You're comfortable?
Yeah.
Yep.
All good.
Come on, just
Thank
thank
my
you.
time on so I know where I'm up to.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I'd like to begin by paying my respects to the First Nations people of this area. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce their name because I know I'll muck that up, but because I'm not from Brisbane, I'm from Sydney. But I do pay my respects to our First Nations people and recognise that their land was never ceded. Some of what I'm going to say will link in with what Kristin and Jay has said, which I guess is the idea of the design of this session. I was born with cerebral palsy, and that has always had an impact on how I participate in my community. So when I was younger, and actually up until a few years ago, I negotiated the world primarily on crutches. A few years ago, my shoulders gave out and I became mostly a wheelchair user. Even when I was moving around on crutches, finding a place to live that I could physically cope with, and particularly finding employment, was always quite challenging and always very much shaped by the physical practicalities that I had to account for. I'm going to put glasses on because I've made my print too small to be able to see in dark light. So the choices that I was making have always been strongly shaped by the fact that I was living with a disability, even though for the most part when I was on crutches I did manage to find employment. As has been mentioned, since I became a wheelchair user though, I have spent more time out of work than in work. So I got a job a couple of months ago. Previous to that, I've spent about 7 years on JobSeeker. I had a few jobs that lasted short times, but I spent most of my time on JobSeeker in the way that has just been described. And as has been mentioned, successive governments have made it more and more difficult for people to get the disability support pension. I'm a wheelchair user and they said no. It doesn't pass what we call the pub test. It's not immediately obvious why that should be the case, but that's what happened. And people said to me, oh, you should have applied when you were younger, you would have got it and then you would have been fine. I didn't need it when I was younger. And I liked the idea of working. I liked the idea of being part of my community the same as all my friends were, so I didn't apply for it. And when I got older, I wondered whether I was supposed to regret that. For disabled people, the present system often becomes a keep busy scheme. It allows the government to feel good about making sure that we look for work, but it offers nothing of substance to make suitable jobs actually available. It keeps us on a poverty income and requires us to waste our lives. It excludes us from our community and effectively punishes us from being disabled. I believe that a universal basic income with other systems in place to cover some of the extra costs of living with disability can turn that around. I think it would help us to make the most of the opportunities that we have and to participate in our community. With a universal basic income, everyone, whether they're disabled or not, will have greater freedom to make our own choices about whether work is a realistic option that we want to pursue according to our circumstances. No one will be required to satisfy someone else that they are poor enough or disabled enough to receive an income. We'll have greater freedom to make our own decisions. When everyone has more choice about whether to work and when to work, it will reduce the stigma of not working. On a universal basic income, disabled people without sufficient paid employment will no longer be living in poverty. I can only work 20 hours a week. That's just what's practical for me with my circumstances. I will never get rich from employment. I will never have even what Australians consider a medium income from employment, most likely. Financial independence will have a huge positive impact on the physical and material well-being of disabled people in our family and friends. We'll have the funds to eat well, socialise with friends in cafes and bars, attend the theatre, go to community meetings, pursue hobbies, be included. The money that we spend is likely to be spent locally and contribute to the local economy. So regardless of whether we work, we will provide the opportunity for other people to do so. If disabled people can afford to show up as customers, businesses and community groups will start to expect us to do so, and they will have a profit motive to provide disability access and support. They need that to bother to do it. This will improve disability inclusion. Australia is currently in a jobs boom unless you're disabled. The disability unemployment rate is about 3 times that of the wider community. Keeping so many people in poverty works against our chances of employment because fewer people encounter us. We are forced by poverty to stay at home so that people don't get to know us. They don't meet us as part of their community. If they did, they could talk to us, learn about us, find out that our dreams and our hopes are often quite similar to theirs. And that contact would improve the chances of other people who are working imagining us being employed beside them and expecting it to happen. When poverty keeps us at home, none of that happens. Even by working at home at the moment, I feel bad about it because people are not seeing me out and about doing work, being a disabled person with a job. So I'm not advancing the cause in that way, which I could be as a person with a visual disability. So even working at home is not perfect. After a while, the whole thing of keeping us at home and keeping us poor means that the assumptions that we have nothing to offer become a self-fulfilling prophecy because we don't get the chance to have experiences, we don't get the chance to develop skills, so then we have less to offer. A UBI could change that. A UBI means that having a good life is no longer dependent on the ability to earn an income. The value of a human being is no longer determined by our value as a unit of production. And that would make disabled people equal members of the community, much more so than pretty much anything else I can think of, because we are no longer forced to compete for employment at a constant disadvantage. UBI makes it easier for human beings to be valued for the things that we can't always put a dollar figure on, like the emotional support that we provide to each other and the satisfaction that we find in developing skills and creativity. A UBI means that if you enjoy creating art and you want to spend your time doing that, you can do it. You don't have to make it commercially viable. The fact that it makes an emotional and social contribution and has value in those respects is sufficient. Given the opportunity to explore and develop their talents, some people might move from creating for fun to a creative business. How many new businesses never start because people don't have the freedom to try? And a UBI also provides the freedom to fail, which for disabled people is incredibly important, because I often need to find different strategies, different ways to do things than what other people do. I don't always know what they are. It can be a lot more than a chair that goes up. Sometimes I need to experiment to find out what's available, or the technology that's going to help me is just around the corner. Microsoft is telling me that there is an update on its way to my computer which will give me live captions. Now, the promotional material around that is saying it's really good for deaf people, which I'm sure it will be. It's also really good for people like me who type slowly and need to be able to make notes from a phone call. But they haven't even thought of that yet. That's on its way to my computer, and I'm hoping that it'll get there before the fact that I can't do those things means that I can't continue in the job that I'm in. It's looking good at the moment, but we'll see. Disabled people who have struggled to find employment will be no longer compelled to look for it. There's been talk already about the compliance policing that is generously referred to as disability employment services. They're not employment providers, they're compliance police. I did find the job that I have through the disability employment service that I'm linked up with. I don't know how much it had to do with the fact that I said, excuse me, there's a jobs boom on at the moment. Why haven't I heard from you? I had heard nothing except from the media that there was this jobs boom. I wonder if I hadn't said that, would I still be on JobSeeker? Would I still be what's referred to as parked by my social security provider, who had decided that it had been so long since I'd been employed that I wasn't worth their effort? And it was interesting in the recent job summit that's been held in Australia to hear employers also saying, yeah, there is this disability employment service, but we don't go to it because it's really bad. Like, even the employers don't find it a useful system. Disabled people with a UBI will be able to actually approach employment strategically if it's something that they want to pursue. So they would actually be able to find people to help them develop strategies and develop skills if that's something they want to do, rather than be forced to continue to apply for jobs over and over again, knowing that it's not going to happen. I once sat in a doctor's office wondering whether I needed support for depression. I knew that the problem wasn't with me. The problem was that the government was placing unrealistic expectations on me, but I'd run out of options and I was crying every day. So I was in the doctor's office. Fortunately, I then connected with some friends who helped me join a progressive political party, and that meant that I didn't need the depression medication, but that's not going to work for everybody. And we haven't quite changed the whole world yet. So, yes, 2 minutes. The last thing I want to make sure I let you know about is that a universal basic income would give disabled people and other people on current forms of welfare the freedom to be involved in intimate relationships that they want to be, and the freedom to leave those relationships when they need to. Disabled people, as you might imagine, face a whole lot of barriers already to being able to find close relationships. But there are people at the moment who don't live with their partner because if they live with their partner, it's going to mean that that partner has to help with their financial support. And that's not fair. My husband has a reasonably low-paying job, but even though he was working, he had to keep saying, oh, can we afford this? Can we afford this? When I was on unemployment benefits. That's not fair, and it stops people from being in relationships. It also means it's harder for them to leave relationships if they need to, and that is completely wrong. But I believe that a universal basic income could help us to address a lot of these problems. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jane. It was an incredible paper that you just given.
Thank you.
And thank you for sharing your expertise. Really, really appreciate it. Okay, so any comments or questions for Jane before we move to Jenny Mays? Yeah, hi. Oh, fabulous. Thank you so much. Yep, excellent.
So Tim asks, how would you see the forward NDIS interacting with UBI?
Okay, so I am also on the NDIS, and I have found it very helpful because it's meant that I've been able to get some specialist physio treatment, for example, that I needed. It's also given me more input into the kind of power wheelchair that I get. I really like that. But the NDIS is kind of a grant system. You work with a person who's employed for the purpose to put together a plan, and then, for example, it says, okay, you can have X number of dollars for physio, you can have this amount for occupational therapy, you can have this amount to look after your power wheelchair. As Kristin said, it's not designed to pay for your food or your life. It's just designed to deal with really specific disability stuff. So, and you have to be accountable for all of it. It's not necessarily a bad thing to have financial accountability in certain areas, but you can only spend it on the things that they've already agreed you're allowed to spend it on. You can't switch it and change it. So I think it could be a good thing to be that extra bundle that we need on top of a UBI, because living with a disability can be quite expensive, and there are other circumstances in people's lives that would count similarly. But it's not going to be, it's not a UBI, because I can't go, oh, I feel like spending some money going out with my friends, I'll just take it out of my NDIS money. I'm not allowed to do that. I'm not able to.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Kristin.
Yeah, that's actually building on that question. But before I do that, I just want to say thank you, Jane, for noting or verbalizing something I hadn't thought about before and articulating the actual time and space to figure out tactics that work for you to do things. You've really named something I hadn't thought about that sort of allowed me to do the work that I'm doing now when I couldn't function in more conventional work contexts. But actually what I wanted to ask is, building on what you've just said and the question was asked, the NDIS is pitched to us as something that offers choice and control. And I'm wondering how differently you would think about your choices and the control in your life if the NDIS didn't exist and you just had enough money to live, versus having a UBI plus getting some supports for disability, right? Because it's kind of a complex question. Do we have a disability payment that's more generous than a UBI to help cover those costs, or are we better with a disability program like NDIS that complements a UBI? I think it is a really important question to tease out, although we don't have much time. But that choice and control language in this conversation kind of have me stewing on those things a bit.
Yeah, I mean, the choice and control thing, there is some choice, there is some control, but it's a lot less than disabled people were expecting when the NDIS was started. And the government in recent years has spent so much money, Kristin can probably put a dollar figure on it, stopping people from getting the support they requested, and disabled people going through a tribunal to get what they reasonably need. It would have been cheaper in most instances, I would think, to just give people what they asked for, even if it was just a little bit generous, rather than spending thousands and thousands of dollars on lawyers to stop people from getting what they asked for. But that's just the priorities of the governments that we've had in recent years, that they would prefer to stop people getting what they want. That being the case, I would rather have a more generous payment that I have complete control over, because then it is my choice and nobody else is going to say, oh, we're going to give you all this control. Oh, actually, no, we're not. So I have less trust for government now than I've ever had in my life. Yeah, so I think give people the control.
Thank you. Thank you, Jen.
Thanks.
Okay, all right, excellent. Oh, if Jen Mays makes your way up for your paper, The Role of Basic Income and Distributive Justice in Reconstituting Disability Conceptions and Redressing Structural Oppression.
I'm just going to make a really horrible noise.
No, that's fine. We'll lift this up too. I think that's all right there, Jen.
Okay, we're done.
Thank you. And that's the video.
Let's see if I can. Right, basically, the. Oh. All right. Oh, there we go. All right. And hello to everyone. Just for that long-winded title, I'm actually taking more of a philosophical approach today that builds on some of the ideas from earlier speakers, including Kristin and Jay and Jane, and trying to look at some of the philosophical frameworks, but bring them into a practical way forward around transitioning to basic income. So some of the critical values that we need to kind of look at. Before I start, I too would like to acknowledge the Turrbal and the Yagara as First Nation owners of the lands for which UQ is situated, and pay respects to the elders' laws, custom and creation spirits, but recognise that the lands have never been ceded. So just to put it into a bit of a context, because I'm going to use a bit of critical policy analysis just to unpack some of the Australian kind of context with neoliberalism and the impact it's had on people with disabilities, the disability dimension, and what that means for thinking about it in a philosophical way, so using a philosophical lens. So essentially, pretty much we're situated in quite that neoliberal embedded approach, and it's infiltrated in Australia our different policies that come about with income support, but it's filtered down into, as previous speakers talked about, everyday practices with professionals, but also in everyday life as well, because that's what neoliberalism wants, a market society where everything's, a buy and sell relationship, you're a customer, etc., but it's heavily reliant on you being self-reliant and also self-regulating in terms of having your behavioural norms and standards and how you're going to participate in everyday life in society. So it's interacted a lot with capitalism, because we still desire or have that great dream, or the average person, to make extreme profits or profits and loss, sell the labour potential, but try and generate wealth through property, but also means of production, etc. Marginalised groups, though, through the different processes have been silenced, because a lot of the structural barriers have left people voiceless and silenced in being able to put forward their own choices and control. And that's shown in different discourses from professional experts, but also through process like mutual obligation and the responsibilities attached to that. What it's done over time has entrenched inequity and structural oppression, and the frames of meaning seen in policy and professional discourses have perpetuated deserving and undeserving poor distinctions and reproduced the ideals of the work ethic and living a good, productive life and being that good, productive citizen in everyday life. Okay. This was just a little bit about how I approached it with my lens, because I quite often use looking at it through that critical policy approach, little bit of a comparison, but I also like to look at the discourses and meanings behind and underpinning different narratives, but also policy approaches, because I wanted to think about how the philosophical can inform basic income as a way to distribute resources or goods and services evenly or more equitably than what they are at this point in time. My vision that underpins it is basically aligns with my passion in trying to transform to a good, socially just society that's inclusive of all people and move away from that more market society that we find ourselves in at this point in time. And one of the things I totally agree with the previous speakers is we've always been conditional in the welfare state, but over time, particularly in the last 4 decades, that control has become tighter, more imposed, more stringent, right down to governing people's behaviours and everyday activities in their life. And there's so much surveillance and checking of people's budgets and checking that they're not spending on alcohol and drugs, especially if they're income support recipients, but even if they're poorer people in low-paid jobs. And the surveillance occurs through the government systems of social protections, but also through professional practices, welfare services, etc. Neoliberalism views a system in which the main player of the state is not sufficient for economic growth, so they push human well-being in terms of a liberated individual entrepreneur self. And freedom occurs through developing, property ownership, rights, wealth, free trade, etc. And what's occurred over time is that belief in the welfare state not having so much of a role in the market, but serving a purpose for the market to set that conditionality on people and welfare recipients and etc. So they look to ideas of social investment, activation, but also, being job ready, having responsibilities as opposed to rights. And along the way, that's pushed down a lot of the discourses and narratives around solidarity, equity, citizens' rights, and social justice and collectivity. So we see a lot of the devaluing and suppressing of, equity, egalitarianism, etc. What we've seen over time, though, is the huge disparities between rich and poor, basically, with the dominant wealthier groups having a lot more power, but also owning a lot of the wealth, the top 1%. At the same time, we've seen people, the working poor, people in poverty, people with disability, old people, younger people, different gender identities, experiencing greater hardship and precarity, basically, because of the changing labour market, less secure jobs, shorter contract type jobs, hostile work environment, but also, not being seen or constructed as that productively contributing to society. Piketty had a good point about when the rate of return exceeds the rate of growth, which is what's occurring at the moment. So the rate of return is far outstripping the rate of growth with the economy, and then inequality grows exponentially. And that's led to this, concentration of power and wealth at the top 1%, and the majority of us, the 99%, are missing out. But it includes the power as well. Neoliberalism, not so much being about market fundamentalism, but used as a process to marketise the state and reconstitute the social welfare state to meet the demands of the market, rather than meet the demands of everyday citizens who actually need income support or some sort of state intervention to survive, and also have other services. It was about reshaping the state rather than how the state works. Oh, sorry, I've sort of said that. But there were hidden frames of meaning and ideology within that process that embedded and entrenched a lot of ideas that were unequal, but also the way it culturally operated to produce an unquestioned common sense idea that it's the best way forward. It problematized constructions of citizenship, particularly in terms of people with disability and other welfare recipients as being welfare dependent. So income support went from being a right and an entitlement that was established through being a citizen to, being a person being welfare dependent if they're in receipt of income support. It actually drew in connotations of unproductive citizenship because of those ideas of welfare dependency. So therefore, instigating ideas that we need to incentivize people to either A, learn how to get a job, so do lots of superfluous training that doesn't help, get certificates to show that they're job ready, or B, participate in mutual obligation schemes to actually get a breadcrumb of income support. Tiny little slice. Okay, so it's become the central organising principle of the way we function in life, but also the way we function with our services and income support systems. It talks about the supply and demand, rational self-interested motivation of individuals, and freedom through self-reliance. We don't support people, we support people to actually fit into the system rather than supporting people to become agents of their own power and, as mentioned before, use the money of how they want to see fit for whatever purpose without being controlled or regulated through that process. It provided a justification for rationalising services, but it also put a lot of the responsibility onto individual shoulders for if they're experiencing poverty, but mental health conditions or other disabilities, or age experiences, etc. And really became quite embedded in the moralising discourses that, supported that social control approach. But unless we confront the challenges of fast capitalism, consumerism, and the way we treat people, particularly people with disabilities, and its hold on politicians, we can't expect a more equal and just and respectful society. So that's why I wanted to think about those philosophical frames and particularly look at the contract between individuals and the state and individuals in the market to start thinking about what is a good society and what's a good life. Living a good life isn't just being a consumer, or being that person that has to jump through hoops just to get an income support pension. An income support provision. We do have that potential point in time where there is an opportunity to reconfigure and change the system. And if we don't sort of look at some of the ideas now, think about them, it's an opportunity lost. So essentially I'm talking about some of those normative framings of the disability dimension, just to drill it down a bit more. I'm going a bit fast, but yeah, I'm happy to take any questions. But I think just to point out a couple of things so I can lead into the opposing ethical frameworks and values. A lot of the way that neoliberalism is embedded through the professional experts and the narratives and the practices are things like what you'll hear constantly, including in the previous presentations, people lacking the motivation to work, not having the desire to work, won't increase social welfare or increasing the provisions because we want to monitor how they spend their money, but we also want to keep that incentive for people to work so they're not languishing on income support. I think one of the other ones by a 40-year-old who'd been working with an OT talked about how the OT responded when they were looking for support within the home to actually live life, not just work. The narrative came back as when they looked at their everyday life of what they did was you act like you're retired, as if that was a bad thing, because they couldn't at that point in time because of their disability manage work. And then the everyday practices of reading, trying to keep relaxed and things like that because they have a lot of trouble focusing, they're impulsive, etc. So the disparaging comments came out. There's no individual choice if people don't have their own labour power or they don't want it exploited in low-paid precarious positions, or that they'll be treated hostilely if they don't have some sort of job or volunteer scheme. 2 minutes? Yeah, I'll just do it really quickly. So what I've been thinking about has been around the conceptions of distributive justice and it ties into people with disabilities, particularly in the way basic income works, but also as a countermeasure to neoliberalism. What we're wanting to do is set those preconditions of social justice, egalitarianism, valuing people's agency, valuing their life, and being free from stringent conditions so that they can operate freely. Within thinking about that, even though depending on how basic income gets provided, whether it'll be through the state or whether it'll be straight down to the communities and there's more power held at the communities, there needs to be rethinking about helping people with disabilities to participate in the decision making around how they want to spend the money, but also supported to actually participate in everyday life in society. So rethinking about opportunities. Currently, the way the philosophical values have worked with distribution tend to categorize still those, strict binaries of, people, and then also essentialize people at the same time, treating all people the same without looking at different divergences of lived experiences. Fraser talks about participatory parity in the process, particularly with resource distribution, so that the governments aren't the only ones making the decision. And it actually starts to produce more, effective approaches for disability inclusivity, particularly in the design and transition to basic income. So what I'm asking for is not just to leave it to brute luck or the experience of people with disabilities being part of the decision making at the grassroots level and at the political level, so that they actually have an opportunity to participate in the design, but also how that translate into everyday, democratic life and civic life, or, participation and solidarity. Okay, so I'll leave it at that point. So they're my little initial ideas that I'm trying to develop as I go through, and I just wanted to kind of float them.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Any questions for Jen, and then we'll open it up. We've got a good half an hour for broader discussion from 3 great presentations. Any specific questions for Jen? How does your sort of model of egalitarian distributive justice sort of relate to, I think, your great question, Kristin, around, the question about NDIS, or should the universal basic income just be paid at a higher rate, and then do you need the NDIS where people, how do you sort of relate to that question coming from your framework?
From my, probably philosophically as well, but very values driven. So I see that you can have a basic income, support provision allocated every day, but there might be things along the life course that you might need to be, where you identify that you might have extra needs or medical costs associated, so you get tested for that, but only for those to help with everyday life. So it's still sort of that separate NDIS, but people have control over it, and it's not testing for disability, it's testing for what you actually need at that particular point in time, which could be anyone, and everyone gets tested. So
Do you want to follow up? Yeah.
It's an interesting point. So one thing, I've been mulling over is, okay, if we're thinking about an actual sustainable minimum basic income and the universal healthcare system, then is that a position where we can say we don't actually need a specific program to make sure, say, the first people with health needs have certain, Jane called it a grants program.
Yeah.
So I think one of the challenges that NDIS responds to is the inadequacies in our healthcare system, right? And also inside more broadly that all these we're talking about creating disability itself. But
yeah,
if we actually had proper healthcare, fully funded, as Jay talked about, the social wage should be part of whatever kind of cash payment, or can't undermine by any cash payment you get. Well, once you start to make those things work well, maybe the NDIS or anything like the NDIS is totally redundant.
I think. Oh, sorry. No, I totally agree. I think I go along the Piketty lines of one way to address inequity and things like that is you strengthen the whole system. So basic income's one part of it. So you can have basic income for income support, so livable, something livable. You can have a basic income for housing as well to help you pay and get access to housing, because we're currently in a housing crisis. But also have other strength, like you said, the healthcare system in a strong position to be able to respond to the people's needs in that respect. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. We've also got, I think, a comment or a question here online. The term disability should be addressed as physically challenged is my observation. So can you all consider this, and it would be good, plus the vibe of UBI. So I think the question is, how do you address disability and UBI? I think they're wondering about the term disability versus physically, sort of physical disability, I think is the question. I don't know, Kristin or Jane, do you want to? Yeah, go for it. Yeah, sorry. It's a bit tricky because I want everyone online to see, plus the video. Yeah, sorry. Let me go. We'll go down. No. We can go down.
And we can also just
Sorry. There we go. Beauty. Yep.
Yeah, I can appreciate what is usually the good intention of people who don't want to use the word disability. It is a bit problematic because it starts with dis, so it starts badly. But I'm going to go on the side of people who say disability is not a bad word. There's a movement called Disability Pride, which I'm proud of, which is about the fact that I have a disability doesn't make me a lesser human being. I do have a disability. Let's all acknowledge that. Don't pretend I don't have one. Just recognise that disability is a normal part of human experience across humanity. It's just not something that everybody experiences until maybe you all get old, and then you don't think of it as disability, you think of it as old age. But when you are 80 or 90 and you might be struggling to get up the stairs, whereas you used to be able to run, that is disability. You are likely to hit it if you live long enough. So I don't have a problem personally with the word disability. I have a problem with the way that people respond to it, with the fact that there are a bunch of people who think it makes me a lesser human than they are just because I was born with a problem that means I can't walk as well as they can.
I just want to add to what Jane said as well. I think terminology has different purposes at different points in time. So disability can be used as a slur, disabled people can be used as a slur. I prefer that term to people with disability, but I think they're both fine. But for example, on this continent, before invasion, disability didn't have a term, didn't exist, because people had different abilities and people were accommodated probably without a whole lot of, thought or need to create all of these complex structures, because the whole society worked differently in a way that was a lot more supportive than maybe what we can imagine now in this neoliberal hell era that we exist in. So I think it would be nice to envision a future where we can get past needing a word like disability, but I think it's really important. And I really agree with the point that I don't know if there's any real utility to rebranding old age as disability, but it is true that the barriers you face due to health conditions you acquire as you get older often are the same as barriers other people face just from a younger age. I don't know how we handle that yet. I haven't thought a lot about that use, but it is really important that accommodations for everyone benefit people at different points in their life. We have different need for this word at different points in history.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. More comments and questions? Hey.
I've got kind of a philosophical question for you guys as well. So Kristin and Jay both went around to say we spent a lot of time on New Start. It was really dog shit, fucking sucked. My first permanent job, I was earning at around the Henderson poverty line. sucked much less. Sucked
Still
a
pretty
little
shit.
bit when the coronavirus supplement came in and it was more than my wage. That
Yeah.
But yeah, you're still very precarious when you're at that level of income. And there's a few kind of first principles that we've talked about, which is in a market society with a monetary economy, access to income is a right. There's another normative claim that everyone is entitled to bread and roses, not just bread. And that disabled people and a lot of other people are actively locked out of markets. They're locked out of labour markets, which means they're locked out of anywhere that currency is used, which is most of everywhere else, and where you access most of your roses. So is, apart from like spending time with other people and having a lovely time, is there then a risk when we're talking about a basic income that, like, what if basic does not include roses? What does that mean for people who are actively locked out of these markets? Or does a UBI, is a UBI kind of a code for, we're kind of getting rid of markets, but it's just unspoken.
You guys want to go first? I've got thoughts.
Who wants to start?
In terms of whether you get roses, one of the things that, when the job seeker payment doubled, I was laughing because suddenly I had enough money to live on. And there were all these other people who'd lost jobs, and I did feel for those people losing jobs. It's never fun to lose a job. But they felt poor on the same amount of money. I had had so much practice living on almost nothing that I felt rich.
Yeah, I felt rich too when I was at that age.
Yeah. And so, I think even if we have what many would think of as a modest income as a UBI, those who are going to benefit most will still find they get some roses because they've been living on such a low amount for so long that there will be some improvement, and they'll know what those improvements are. Whereas, people who maybe are employed at that point and then think about, should I just live on the UBI for a while? They might hesitate because they might think it's not enough. But the people who've been doing it honestly tough, I reckon they'll find some roses on it.
Yeah, so true, I need to get close to the mic. So that is one of my concerns about a UBI, is that it will actually perpetuate a market-based system, and that it will then, erode certain protections from the state and funnel that into a market-based system. So that is one thing that I'm concerned about, but that's not enough for me to disregard the concept and practice of it. So I think what also needs to be done and thought about is how to build communities. And I think, I don't want to say that there's an instinctual or human kind of element where we will naturally create and facilitate communities once we have the time away from labor exploitation to do that. But I think there is already that kind of intuition, is that everybody's already doing things we do things naturally. We care for people, whether that's family or friends or within the community. I mean, Elise, who worked with treating families fairly, found that people, when they didn't have any mutual obligations and when they had, a livable income, they were volunteering more. They were, trying to find work more. It was, actually creating ability. So it was removing the disability, if you will. So yeah, as much as I am concerned that it may perpetuate or even strengthen market-based systems, I am hopeful that, given the right material conditions, it might actually mobilize communities to actually integrate in the sense of coming together to, create something more fundamentally strong and supportive without heavily relying on a market-based system. So.
Yeah, so you could...
Yeah, we should all know you say that. We'll stand back.
I'll move. Yeah, so you could look at then, because you could still have a running market system, but just don't have it as the dominant or the neoliberal type approach, and also have the egalitarian, more democratic, and build in safeguards that protect people in the community and the power, and look at different ways of reconstituting jobs, how we define jobs, and not just calling it paid work. Having different ideas about art and volunteering or caring, things like that. So it's kind of like or the way I see it, it's a change of a lot of things altogether, and basic income is part of that process towards it, because we've come down so far into this world where we're losing, even though it wasn't perfect, full employment, not perfect, neither was the post-war reconstruction, but it had egalitarian elements that we could draw on and redefine and start over again, because we've dropped so far away from it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Is there another?
Yeah, just linked to this question about disability. So he just wanted more sort of re-clarifying his question. It's should psychosocial issues and UBI, should that be looked into?
I can probably touch on that.
Yeah. Sorry.
But I wanted just to pick up on one final thing in relation to Damia's question about poor people deserving nice things. And so we've got a session, obviously, I don't know if it's tomorrow or Wednesday, about what it would mean for artists if we had a UBI. And I think having a UBI would mean things like art and creativity could happen without a need to commodify art and creativity, and that creates some of the beauty that we may feel unable to access right now because, the cost of a theatre ticket or the cost of buying a beautiful piece of art, which I'm constantly wanting to do and very rarely able to do. But so some of those things would actually also become more accessible to us as a result of the UBI. But on the flip side, this is sort of my concern around the idea of that social means test. Like, what then actually is considered acceptable for a good life? Like, what's an acceptable level of contribution? What's an acceptable level of what we're allowed to have? And so I guess that I don't think there is an answer. It's all about defining things that I don't think can be defined is probably the ultimate challenge. I guess I'm sure you would probably agree to me, and probably most people would agree that, like, if we could get radically better than where things are right now, we could possibly spend more energy teasing out these complex questions if we could just simply have enough for everyone to afford to eat. And on the question of psychosocial disability, I'm not so... I guess this kind of gets back to the point earlier about the healthcare system, and probably folks online wouldn't have been able to hear my comment because I was at the back of the room. But for example, the largest amount of funding in my NDIS package goes to my psychologist. If psychology was a free part of the healthcare system and we had enough practitioners to be able to provide adequate services to everyone, then I wouldn't, like, that extra cost of my disability is taken away. So, I think that a basic income will still, all of these things are intersected. This is kind of why we wanted to talk about, like, a whole ecosystem together, right? Because then you have the question of, okay, well, what sort of housing accommodations, what things make my brain work better in my housing context? And again, if we had a great, well-designed public housing system that was accessible in the sense of physically accessible, but also able to be accessed because there was more of it, then, the quality of that housing would make a difference to how much I need to access the healthcare system or something like an NDIS. Even just through this hour, I just feel like there are so many things, if we actually achieved all we wanted in the other parts of the social wage, that the NDIS would become irrelevant. But in terms of psychosocial disability and a UBI, I don't think a UBI solves the problems that I face as a person with psychosocial. I've got bipolar and autism, and also a couple of other things thrown in the mix that make that really complicated. I don't think a UBI fixes that for me. No. And that's again why we talk about lifelong wage replacement. I feel like I was going to lead to somewhere there.
Kristin's quite right. There are things that a UBI won't fix in terms of psychosocial disability. People like me who were sitting in the doctor's office looking for depression support wouldn't be sitting in the doctor's office looking for depression support. Yay me, I joined the Greens instead. Thank you to my Greens comrades, but not everybody manages to do that. So
that was exactly my point, is that we probably wouldn't need that many more psychologists if there weren't as many people living in poverty. Because
just a quick comment on that. I'm not sure what it is, but there has actually been a recent study which actually studied the impact of more money in your pocket versus going to the psychologist and they actually found more money in your pocket had a bigger effect than going to, not dissing psychologists, they're very valuable, but
totally.
But over, so the UBI perhaps could,
Absolutely. And Sylvie actually was involved in a piece of work from Australia's mental health think tank that, you know, one of the outcomes of that work was to say, give people money. Like, because being depressed is partly about deprivation. Deprivation causes psychosocial disabilities that are less complex in some respects. And that's where people with much higher needs then could actually be able to rely on the resources that it's, hello Tim, I didn't notice that.
Well, no, I was just literally going to say that I literally remember saying to my therapist, I am depressed because I have no money. And she's like, oh, well, maybe let's discuss some coping mechanisms.
Oh, my fucking
I just like looked at her, I was just like, well, is money a coping mechanism?
I guess that principle kind of just like for everything is just like, well, we shouldn't be building prisons and, you know, having heaps of cops when, you know, maybe a lot of the causes of crime are linked inherently to money, like property crimes. Why does that happen? But yeah, it's pretty obvious.
I don't know what the amount is in Australia or in other countries, but I know in Canada, poverty in preventable things such as crime and healthcare costs Canadian taxpayers $80 billion per year.
Yeah,
it's preventable.
And then the disabilities that you create from
Right.
that, but then have an ongoing.
I'm not quite sure what my question is, but just wondering really whether you have any insight on this that fits into anything of what you guys have been saying. It's just carers for people with disability and how that all fits into it, and respite and all of that. If there's any particular insight or reflection on that.
Yeah, a lot of the carers are already there. They're just not recognised or it's not considered labour when it obviously is. And obviously there is a need for, you know, respite care as well, because you can't obviously, as Jane was talking about before, you know, so there's obviously, you know, it's painful to have to give, to feel like a burden on someone else.
And when I was listening to the material from the Job Summit the other day, there was a woman who spoke who is a carer. So she doesn't live with disability directly herself. She's caring for her son who's disabled. Because she is a carer, she is discriminated against when she goes to look for work. Because she is a carer, she cannot find work.
That one is something that we hear from a lot of people who are on the job seeker payment, is because they can't get a job because it won't fit around their caring responsibilities. And then on top of that, you have, I tend to think about it as like carers payment and welfare payments for people who are doing caring labour is also just perpetuating kind of inequalities, because people who have more financial resources can afford to have supports come into the home, can afford to go and do things that give everyone in the family space and take off and alleviate some of the strain that might come with like having to care for each other and live in really stressful environments. But I think, we have this, like, again, that question of like, how much do we want to commodify care? And so it's, where do we draw these lines? So that's another constant question that's coming up. There is currently an inquiry into work and care. I would encourage everyone to get in a late submission, which is what we're hoping to do. Because this is the stuff they're not looking at, right? They're thinking about it in a very narrow way of like, how do we just create more care jobs? And maybe that'll like do something to deal with the fact that we have all of these disabled folks who need more support than they're getting, and are not already the quality of support is not high enough. But that's such a narrow view of it. And what we need to be thinking about is, again, if we all just had like the basics covered, we would all be doing a lot more care work for each other. All of us are doing care work already. Those of us who do this work, we do a lot of care.
And the government exploits that. It saves them billions a year unpaid care, regardless whether it's supporting your family member, children or friends. They save billions on it. Yeah. So they re-entrench that process instead of looking at different ways, or introducing something like basic income and other measures to support people.
It's one of the questions they ask when you put together your NDIS plan. They say, what support do you get from your friends and family? And they ask you so that they know, so that they can say, oh, we don't need to supply you with a paid carer to do that because your husband does it. You don't, you have to be really organised and really on top of things to say, well, my husband does it right now, but he doesn't want to keep being my carer. He wants to be my husband. So can we organise a paid carer to do this as part of my plan? If you're not really on top of that, you can end up with a lot less care dollars than you might otherwise get. And that's not right.
Perverse advantage to being isolated because you're like, no one's helping me.
Is there more questions and comments that people might have?
Can I just ask a
quick
one?
Sure.
Sorry, and more to Jane, I think, on that point that you're just talking about. So is it better just to say, no one's helping me? How much auditing is there and surveillance is there around then, okay, well, what is your husband doing? And those sorts of questions that might flow from that. I'm just interested in your experience.
I'm not sure how to answer because I don't need a lot of care directly. So I've actually travelled to Brisbane on my own and I'm staying in a hotel by myself. And as long as nothing goes really weirdly wrong, that'll be fine. So I'm not sure what the situation is for people who do routinely need care. But I do often find that as I move around the community, there are situations where it's only going to work if I have a carer with me. Like if I want to get into the pub, it's accessible as long as somebody else opens the door. But if there's nobody else there to open the door, then I'm going to sit on the street. Excuse me, could you please open the door for me?
We've got a comment here from In Charge saying thanks so much for all your comments. Another question here from Tim. If we had a UBI, it would replace the dole but not other welfare, example, rent, assistance, healthcare. What about carer's allowance? Would it replace that?
Yeah, there you go.
Jane, did you want to add? I think that the number one payment that you probably couldn't get rid of is a disability payment, specifically because of the fact that I do think it needs to be a lifelong wage replacement. But if you think about it that way, then you start to go, well, if someone's going to be caring for their family member or someone else for a long, long period of time, that it should be much more generous than what a subsistence payment might be viewed as. So, I think, again, it comes down to definitions, but I do think we run the risk when we're talking about a universal basic income of oversimplifying it and suggesting that everyone having a certain level of payment, even if we called it an adequate payment, that adequate does look different for different groups for certain reasons. And like I said, if all of the costs, the extra costs of disability were accounted for through, say, the healthcare system, but you're a person who may never have a prospect of getting waged work, then there's a reason why someone should not be kind of confined in a way because of social discrimination to spend their whole life stuck on a payment. And I'm not sure that really applies quite the same way to carers. Also just to add, Zoe, I felt very privileged that I didn't have anyone that I was like able to say, this person does this for me, because it felt like that made doing my plan easier and easier to justify supports that went into that plan, which, as I said, it's a very perverse kind of way of thinking about it.
Thank you. Any last questions or any last reflections that you want to make?
I just want to say it's exciting to get to a point, even though just to talk about it, not through some of these complexities, because it just builds that stronger solidarity, I think, and helps to progress forward, even if, we've got to make some little bumbles along the way or choices and things like that.
The thinking about what you said, Zoe, about the NDIS, but like in the social, just like, with job seeker or like youth allowance, there is surveillance in that, in the sense it's like, if you're not transparent with us, they will send private eyes to spying on you to make sure that you're not flouting rules.
Yeah.
How widespread that is probably not possible for the amount of people on it, but they do it in cases which they believe are necessary.
There's a $200 million contract essentially that went out last year, just
Yeah.
specifically for surveillance of
So like it does exist, but like there's just this need to like create a criminal class out of people who require help. The welfare state is, mainly now for like middle and upper classes through taxation and private health subsidies and private education and those kinds of things. And you know what? There's probably far more criminals there than there are in the lower classes. Sorry,
abolitionists.
But like, So it's just like we're far more likely as a society to punish people who actually deserve it rather than deserve help, deserve support rather than those who have the means and the capacity to be able to do it.
I did sort of also been thinking about your point before, Jay, around UBI and market-based economy. Maybe reflect on Jen's presentation, because it seemed you're making a distinction between neoliberalism and capitalism, which of course there are, but it seemed to see that there's some sort of relationship between egalitarian and non-neoliberal capitalism. And I'm just wondering if that's true, because my sense is that exclusion and ordering and ordering of bodies has always been part of capitalism. And people with disabilities have constantly been excluded. You were talking about it. It's very expensive to live with a disability because, what is counted as normal is the normal worker body is coherent within sort of a capitalist frame. So exclusion is structurally inherent because of that. And then Indigenous scholarship has long talked about, for colonialism to end, capitalism must die. I mean, they didn't come here on a tourism voyage. They came here to make money and to expand the empire, and they've continued. Coloniality has continued. So I'm just wondering about that question around, I think, the critique of neoliberalism is fair. And then, going back to your comments, Jay, where does that leave us in terms of the sort of economy or economies that are left? And are we just okay with slow capitalism?
I mean, I guess if you're contrasting neoliberalism with other forms of capitalism, there was a time before neoliberalism, and as you say, that was not a good time for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So, Good comment.
Smash the system.
Look,
break the poverty machine.
Yes. Is there really a requirement for capital and in accumulating mass amounts of it? Well, personally, I don't believe so. But there are people who genuinely do believe that. But obviously, I think it's capitalism and accumulating capital is inherently contradictory of ensuring that you're creating and developing a meaningful and supportive society, which I think we all believe in, regardless of where we lie on a political spectrum. We do believe that everybody requires fairness and equity and equality. I think a UBI is a pathway to that, but there's obviously other things that we need to develop around and in any form of state that would implement that, or non-state, to kind of ensure that those structures are there to guarantee and lock it in to prevent a blowout, which will just in the current situation we're in with ecological failure and economic destruction. But,
Jen, did you wanted to say anything too?
Oh no, I just said that before about working together in solidarity.
Yeah.
That's great.
All right, excellent. Well, please join with me in thanking for fabulous great expertise and your contributions. Huge. Thank you. We have now afternoon tea for half an hour.
We don't drink.
Thanks.
yeah. I think Sylvie wants to get a photo.
That is terrible light, so I want you to, where you were, Jane, is perfect actually, but now you, sorry, I didn't know it.
It's all right. We can move in front of the desk because otherwise, so Jamie, you want to come this way or do you want to come that way? Because I can move this stuff and make it easier. Go on.